The entire boardroom went quiet the moment she walked in on crutches, and every single person suddenly found something very important to look at on their phones. I noticed because I was the only one who didn't look away. My name is Joel Tanner, and at 28 I was the newest junior project coordinator at Hartwell & Associates, a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm based in Ottawa. I'd landed the job 3 weeks earlier after 2 years of grinding through contract work and short-term placements that never quite stuck. My dad had taken early retirement after a back injury on a highway maintenance crew near Sudbury. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, just the slow kind of damage that compounds over years until one morning you can't get out of bed without help. My mom had gone back to part-time work at a pharmacy to cover the gap. I sent money home when I could. I needed this job to last. The annual Hartwell Winter Gala was held at the Chateau Laurier, right there in the heart of Ottawa, that grand old stone building that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale, and charges like it too. I wore the one suit I owned that still fit properly. I remember standing near the entrance and watching the other guests arrive. Partners in tailored wool coats, senior consultants who moved like they already owned every room they walked into, spouses draped in quiet, expensive things. I was very aware of exactly where I stood in that hierarchy. Then Caroline Hartwell arrived. I knew who she was from the company directory photo, the only daughter of firm founder Gerald Hartwell, and nominally listed as Director of Community Partnerships, though I'd been told by a colleague to not expect to see her much. What the directory photo hadn't shown me was the forearm crutches she moved on now, or the way the left side of her walk carried a careful, measured stillness, like someone who had learned to trust their body again, only in increments. She wore a deep green dress and her dark hair was pulled back, simply. She was maybe 32. She was, without question, the most composed person who had entered that room all evening. The whispering started before she'd reached the second pillar. Not loud. These were professionals. The whispers were the kind you felt rather than heard. A shift in body language, a slight turning away. Conversations that became very focused in the direction opposite to where she was walking. A senior partner I recognized named Howard Belisle suddenly became deeply interested in the canapé tray. 2 women near the window found urgent reason to move toward the bar. Even the people who smiled at her did so with that particular careful brightness that means, I see you, but I don't know what to do with what I see, so I'm going to smile very hard and hope that covers it. She found a spot near the tall windows overlooking the canal, stood there alone. The city lights reflected on the dark water below, and she held her champagne flute and looked out at them with an expression I recognized immediately, even from across the room. It wasn't sadness. It was something quieter and more exhausting than sadness. It was the look of someone who had already done the math on how this evening was going to go, and had accepted the answer and was simply waiting for it to be over. I knew that look. I'd worn it myself in different rooms for different reasons. My supervisor at the time, a sharp-edged man named Trevor Mack, appeared at my elbow. Mingle, he said, without looking at me. Talk to the Beaumont people, 3rd table from the left. Don't hover by the windows. I said I'd be right there. I wasn't right there. I don't know exactly what moved me across that room. I want to say it was simple human decency, and maybe it was. But I also remember a feeling closer to anger, a low, steady anger at the choreography of avoidance I was watching, at the precision with which an entire room of educated, accomplished people had found a way to make one woman feel invisible without doing anything overtly unkind. That's a particular skill, the art of socially acceptable cruelty, and I had watched it performed with depressing expertise my entire life. At my dad's old union meetings, at the hospital waiting rooms where nobody made eye contact with the family whose news was going to be bad, at every place where people sense vulnerability and quietly step to the other side of the road. I set my glass down on a passing server's tray, straightened my jacket, and walked over. I introduced myself simply. Joel Tanner, new project coordinator, started 3 weeks ago, still learning where the good coffee is. I said it the way you say something to a person, not to a situation. I didn't look at the crutches. I didn't look away from them either. I just looked at her. She blinked. It was a very small thing, but I caught it. A flicker of genuine surprise, like someone bracing for a wave and finding calm water instead. Her name was Caroline Hartwell. She said it without the weight of the last name, just offered it as a name, the way you do when you're tired of the name carrying everything it carries. She had a dry, quiet sense of humor that surfaced almost immediately, Something about how the chateau's heating system had clearly been designed by someone who believed winter builds character. I laughed. Not because I felt like I should, but because it was actually funny, and she noticed the difference. We talked for a while. She asked me where I was from originally, and when I told her I'd grown up in Timmins and gone to Carleton for my degree, she asked what Timmins was like in January, and I said brutal, and she said she'd driven through once in February and had genuinely wondered if the sun had given up on the region entirely, and I said that was basically the civic motto. She had an easy warmth beneath the composure, the kind you only find in people who've had to build it deliberately out of harder materials than ease. At some point I asked, carefully, because I wanted to ask and also didn't want to treat it as the most interesting thing about her, if she minded talking about the crutches. She looked at me for a moment, and whatever she was deciding seemed to resolve itself. 3 years ago, she told me, she'd been driving back from a volunteer site near Pembroke, where the Hartwell Foundation funded an after-school program. It was early November, just past dusk. A logging truck had jackknifed on the 17th and clipped 2 cars into the ditch. One of the cars had a family inside, parents in the front, a 7-year-old girl named Petra in the back seat. Caroline was the second vehicle to stop. She was the one who got to Petra's door first in the dark, on a road that smelled of diesel and pine and cold, and she pulled the door open and got the girl out and carried her up the embankment just before the car shifted and the ditch filled with water from a cracked fuel line. The embankment was steep and icy and Caroline fell. The fall damaged her L3 vertebra and her left hip in ways that several surgeries had mostly but not entirely corrected. Petra had gone home with her parents 2 days later without a scratch. The media had covered it for about a week and a half. Then they moved on, and Caroline was left with the crutches and the surgeries, and the very specific exhaustion of being someone whose story people thought they understood because they'd read 4 paragraphs about it. She told me all of this in a level, unadorned way, the way you tell a story you've made peace with but not yet finished making peace with. I told her she was the most interesting person I'd met at a firm event, which was true, and also that the bar was not particularly high, which made her laugh, and the laugh changed her whole face. We talked until Trevor materialized at my shoulder again with the energy of a man who had run out of patience and diplomatic phrasing at roughly the same time. I excused myself. Caroline thanked me for stopping by, simply and directly, the way you thank someone when you mean it, and don't have any other way to say so. I went and talked to the Beaumont people. I don't remember a single thing about that conversation. The next morning I was summoned to the 32nd floor. Gerald Hartwell's office occupied the northeast corner of the Hartwell & Associates building on Elgin Street and had floor-to-soiling windows that faced the Rideau Canal and, beyond it, the Old City. It was the kind of office that communicated power so effortlessly it didn't need to try. Gerald himself was 63, white-haired, the kind of man who had been built by decades of hard decisions and had the stillness that comes from that. He had a reputation for being direct and fair and occasionally terrifying. He was looking at me when I came in the way I imagined he looked at contracts, carefully, without hurry. I was quite certain I was being let go. He asked me to sit down. He asked me to explain, in my own words, what I had been thinking the previous evening. I said I wasn't thinking anything in particular. I said I saw someone standing alone and it seemed like the straightforward thing to do was go over and say hello. He looked at me for a long time after I said that. Long enough that I started wondering which specific word had ended my career. Then he said, that was the first time in 8 months Caroline had stayed at a company event past the first hour. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. He told me that after the accident, Caroline had spent 11 months in rehabilitation between Toronto and Ottawa, and that when she'd returned she had slowly, methodically begun to withdraw from most of the public-facing parts of her life. Not because she was broken, he said, and the way he said it told me he needed to say it. Not because she was broken, but because people's responses to her had made rooms feel like work in a way that had become unsustainable. She had stopped attending board functions. She had pulled back from the foundation's public events. He had watched his daughter become very skilled at occupying the margins. He asked if I would be willing to be transferred to the Hartwell Foundation's Community Programs Division, effective the following month. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to be honest about something here, because this story deserves honesty. I didn't say yes because of Caroline. I said yes because it was a better role with a broader mandate and because I genuinely believed in what the foundation did. The programs they funded, the after-school sites, the trades apprenticeship grants, the emergency housing partnerships. These were things I cared about, things that had mattered in my own family's life, things that weren't abstractions to me the way they sometimes were to people who hadn't needed them. I would have said yes to that job regardless, but I'd be lying if I said the thought of seeing Caroline again wasn't part of the equation. The first weeks in the new division were straightforward busy work, site visits, grant reporting, coordinating with community partners in Nepean and Vanier and Gloucester. Caroline attended some of the internal meetings, sitting near the end of the table, contributing precisely when she had something precise to say and not otherwise. She was sharper than people assumed. I noticed that she noticed things that other people in the room hadn't thought to notice. A gap in a funding model, a logistical assumption that would fail in February when the van couldn't navigate the Vanier streets after a snowfall, a community partner whose representative seemed uncertain and needed to be followed up with privately rather than on the call. She was good at her work in the way that people are good at things they've had to rebuild their relationship with from the ground up. We started getting coffee occasionally after the Thursday site review calls. A place on Bank Street with exposed brick and mismatched mugs that took their oat milk seriously. She would order the same thing every time, dark roast, 1 sugar, and I would try something different every week because I had not yet found a coffee I liked well enough to be loyal to, which she found mildly exasperating and somewhat endearing, she told me once, both at the same time. We talked about work, mostly. Then about other things. She had studied environmental policy at McGill before pivoting toward the foundation. She had a younger brother named Spencer, and here I should say, Spencer is not the kind of name in the list I'd been warned away from, though I'll avoid the ones that came close. She had opinions about the Rideau Canal skateway that were more nuanced than most people's, involving a fairly detailed critique of the NCC's surface maintenance approach in mild weather years. She was learning to play the guitar again, which she'd started before the accident and stopped after it, and she was now, she said, at the precise skill level where she could play 3 chords confidently and ruin any song that required a 4th. I told her about my dad, the back injury, the early retirement, the way our family had quietly rearranged itself around a new center of gravity without talking much about the rearranging. She listened in the way that people listen when they understand from the inside what it means to have a life that looked one way and then was required to look another way, and to have done that rearranging mostly in private. There were hard stretches. This is the part that doesn't always make it into stories like this, the parts that aren't cinematic. In February, a photograph from the gala appeared in a business features piece in the Ottawa Citizen, the kind of fluff that fills the back half of a weekend section. And the photo happened to include Caroline, and whoever captioned it described her as Gerald Hartwell's daughter, followed by a phrase about her recovery that she found reductive and hadn't consented to. She read it at the Thursday coffee. She set her phone face down on the table and was quiet for a long time. I didn't try to fill the silence. There's a specific kind of care that looks like stillness, and that was what the moment required. There were meetings where the optics people, and every organization has optics people, floated the idea that Caroline's public profile might be better managed with certain limitations. Managed. I watched her face when she heard the word. She didn't flinch. But I'd been watching her face long enough to know what controlled calm cost her. One evening after a late Foundation Board prep session, at the Elgin Street office, we walked out into a March night that hadn't quite decided if it wanted to be winter or something else. The canal was still partially frozen, lit by the path lamps, and the city had that particular quality it gets in early spring, raw, slightly provisional, like it's been asked to start over and is doing its best. She stopped on the bridge and looked at the ice. She said she had spent a long time after the accident, believing that a certain version of her life, the version where she moved through the world without calculation, without reading every room for whether it was going to be work, that version was simply gone, and she had needed to mourn it and stop expecting it back. She said she'd done that. She had genuinely done that. But she hadn't expected, after having done all that work, to find that the world was still capable of surprising her. I asked what she meant. She looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the canal. She said she meant the gala in December, and the coffee on Bank Street, and the Thursday calls, and the fact that at some point she had stopped calculating before she spoke and had simply started speaking. She said, "You gave me that back, not the version of me from before, but a version I didn't know was still possible." I didn't have a clean response to that. I told her that she'd given me something too, that working on things that actually mattered, in a place that treated them like they mattered, had been something I hadn't known I needed as badly as I did. That felt true and also insufficient, so I left it there. By the time the Foundation's spring grant cycle launched, Caroline was leading the public-facing sessions. Not with fanfare, she specifically asked that there be no fanfare, no press releases about her return to anything, no narrative about resilience that she hadn't herself. Just showed up in rooms full of community partners and city councilors and after-school program coordinators and did the work. She was direct and prepared and occasionally funny, and people responded to her the way people respond to someone who is genuinely present. I was at the back of the room the first time she ran the Vanier Partnership briefing, 23 people around a long folding table in a community center on Montreal Road. Fluorescent lighting, bad coffee from a drip machine, one of the radiators making a sound like a small animal in distress. She walked them through the grant renewal framework and the adjusted timelines and answered questions with a specificity that made the representatives take notes. Nobody treated it as remarkable. That was exactly the point. Afterwards, outside in the parking lot, waiting for my car, I let myself feel what I'd been keeping quiet during the meeting. A particular kind of pride that doesn't belong to you but sits near you, warm and uncomplicated. The Foundation's community reach expanded that year, new after-school sites in Canada and Barrhaven, an expanded trades bursary program in partnership with Algonquin College, an emergency housing pilot in the Glebe. Caroline was the one who pushed the Algonquin partnership through 3 rounds of internal skepticism about scope and feasibility. She knew what trades training had meant for families like mine. She didn't argue abstractly. She argued with specifics, with data, with names from site visits, and eventually the room ran out of objections. Months pass differently when you're inside them. What I can tell you is that at a certain point, the Thursday coffees became Tuesday and Thursday coffees, and then sometimes Saturdays, and the conversations moved through layers the way conversations do when both people are willing to keep going deeper. And at some point, the thing between us had become something that neither of us had been looking for. And both of us had arrived at, honestly. She told me once, late in the fall, sitting in her car outside my apartment building in Centretown, that the accident had taken a lot of things, but the strangest loss had been her faith that she knew what ordinary felt like, that she'd lost the baseline, that the hardest part of recovery wasn't the physical work, relentless as it was, but the effort of reconstituting a sense of what a normal day could feel like when so many normal things had become complicated, and that what she had missed most, more than any specific activity or ability, was the experience of being in a room and not having to think about being in the room. She said that had come back. Not all the way, maybe. Not for every room, but enough. The second annual gala at the Chateau Laurier fell on a Thursday in early December. The canal outside was frozen solid by then, the city in full winter form, and the old building was lit up the way it gets in December, warm and amber against the dark and the cold. Caroline walked in without crutches. Not permanently. She still used them when she needed to. And she would tell you that herself without any drama. Because she'd long since stopped making her own mobility a metaphor. But that evening, in that building, she walked in on her own. In the same deep green she'd worn the year before, deliberate as a statement she'd chosen to make only for herself. I was standing near the same window where I'd first noticed her. She came and stood beside me, and we looked out at the canal together for a moment, the lights on the ice, the dark sky, the city doing what northern cities do in winter, carrying on with everything it takes to carry on. She didn't say anything grand. She said, "Same terrible canapés." I said, "I think they're worse, actually. I think they found a way." She smiled. The room moved around us, conversations rising and falling, the particular white noise of 100 people doing professional socializing, and none of it touched us. We went and did the work the evening required, talked to partners and city officials and foundation donors and this new junior staff member standing near the pillar who looked about as out of place as I had 12 months before. Caroline made a point of going over to him. I watched her do it. She introduced herself simply, asked him where he was from, listened when he told her, and made him feel, in about 4 minutes, like the room had space for him. I don't think she knew I was watching, or maybe she did and didn't mind. Either way. Near the end of the evening, the small ensemble in the corner of the main hall shifted into something slower, and people cleared a little space on the marble floor, and Caroline turned to me the way you turn to someone when you know exactly what you're going to ask, and you're not uncertain about the answer. We danced. I'm not a particularly skilled dancer, which she already knew, and the floor was slightly crowded, and at one point I stepped on the hem of my own trousers, which she absolutely noticed and recorded for future reference. But none of that was the point. The point was the room and the year between us, and the particular quality of standing with someone you know in a place where you started as strangers. She leaned in at some point and said quietly, almost to herself, "Last year I came here and stood at that window and told myself this was just another room I had to survive. I waited," she said. "I don't feel that way tonight." That was all she said. But she said it the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to set down. I think about that evening a lot. I think about the specific arithmetic of small decisions. The choice to cross a room, to set a glass down on a passing tray and not think too hard about the consequences, to say hello to someone who everyone else had found a reason not to say hello to. None of it felt like courage at the time. It felt like the ordinary thing to do, which I suppose is what courage usually feels like when you're inside it, rather than describing it afterward. What I know now is this: the rooms we move through shape us, and we shape them too, even when we think we're too small to matter in them. Caroline taught me that without meaning to. She taught me it every time she walked into a room that expected to be work for her and refused to let it be. Every time she answered a question precisely when the easier thing would have been to deflect. Every time she showed up to something the old version of herself would have declined. Not because she had healed past the difficulty of it, but because she had decided that difficulty was not a reason to keep shrinking. She told me once that the night at the gala had given her something she didn't have a clean word for. Not hope exactly, not confidence. Something more like permission. Permission to take up space again, in rooms that had started to feel like they'd already decided she didn't belong in them. I think about the people who turned away that first evening, and I don't hold it against them. Avoidance is usually fear in a good coat, but I think about what it cost her. All the rooms where that fear decided the arrangement before she even sat down, and I think about what it costs the people around us when we choose comfort over the small, necessary act of just showing up for each other. That's the thing about standing at a window alone in a room full of people. You can see everything from there: the lights on the water, the city carrying on, the whole illuminated ordinary world, and none of it is quite close enough to touch. You just need someone to come and stand beside you, not to fix anything, not to make it a story, just to stand there and stay.